My name is Ethan, and I'm a logging and land clearing contractor up in Aroostook County, Maine. I'm 38 years old, and I've been working in the woods in one way or another since I was old enough to use a saw without getting myself killed. Most of my work these days is small to medium private jobs, right-of-way clearing, hazard tree removal along camp roads, and storm cleanup. This particular job was a few miles northeast of Ashland. The land belonged to a family that leased cutting rights to a small timber company. The company I sometimes work for had the contract to widen and clean up the access road, so loaded trucks and service vehicles could use it year-round, without brushing mirrors or dodging leaners. They handed me that piece as a sub. It was late October. I was alone. For a job like this, light widening and taking down marked hazards, I don't usually bring help unless there's a lot of heavy falling near structures or power lines. Out here, it was just trees, ditches, and gravel. I arrived early, just before first light. My headlights picked up the usual. 2 tracks of brown gravel, grass in the center, brush creeping in from both sides. The flagged trees were easy enough to pick out in my lights. Orange paint and ribbon on trunks leaning toward the road, some already dead, some just in the wrong place for the width they wanted. I pulled off on a wide spot about a quarter-mile in, nose pointed back the way I'd come. That's a habit. If you get hurt, or a tree goes where it shouldn't, or the weather turns, it's nice not to have to back a truck out of a tight spot in a hurry. Before I started, I topped off my new 20-inch chainsaw, checked the chain tension, and gave everything a once-over. I put everything onto a small plastic sled I keep for dragging gear along roadsides, grabbed the wedges and axe, and started walking further in, just like I've done 10,000 times. There was nothing special about the first 15 minutes. I picked a dead spruce leaning over the ditch for the first tree of the day, set up my notch, made the back cut, and set a wedge when it started to sit. It went where it was supposed to go, down into the brush away from the road, with the usual crash and rattle of branches. My mind was busy calculating how many trees I could knock down and clean up before lunch. If you'd asked me then, I would have told you it was shaping up to be a normal, quiet day. I had no reason to think otherwise. The first time I noticed anything off was right after I finished with the 3rd tree. It was a spruce, not huge, but big enough that I had to pay attention. The notch and back cut went just the way they were supposed to, and the tree fell clean into the brush without giving me any trouble. I limbed what I needed to, then shut the saw off and dropped it to have a breather. I sat down, pulled out a sandwich, and started eating. I've always loved being out in the woods, just taking in everything around me. That's when the hair on the back of my neck went up. I don't know how else to put it. It wasn't a sound I consciously registered at first. It was more like my body decided something wasn't right, and told me before my eyes and ears caught up. I stopped chewing and started actively listening, expecting maybe another truck had come through the gate, or a landowner had walked in on foot. The woods got very quiet. No squirrel chatter, no small bird flits, dead quiet. My eyes went to the brush on the far side of the ditch, opposite the tree I'd been cutting. The slope dropped away from the road a little there, then leveled off into a tangle of slash and young firs from an older cut. Between 2 of those fir clumps, maybe 30-35 yards out, I saw something standing. At first, my brain slotted it in as a guy in dark clothes. It was upright, shoulders broad, head roughly where a head should be. It was just standing there, not moving, like someone had stopped to watch me work. That happens sometimes on the edges of jobs near houses or camps. People are curious, they wander over, but there was nothing anywhere close to this stretch, and the longer I looked at that shape, the less it looked like a person. What threw me off was the posture. It wasn't cleanly upright like a man standing there. It was hunched forward through the shoulders and upper back, like it was built to lean into whatever it was doing. Once I saw that, the legs didn't read right either. They looked too long in the thigh and too short below, with a bend in them that made my mind want to say dog or deer instead of man. The arms hung down farther than they should have on any normal human, almost to mid-thigh, maybe a bit lower. I couldn't make out much color in the early light, just dark against dark, but the outline from shoulder to elbow to forearm was thick, not parka thick, muscle thick. The head bothered me too. It took a while to make sense of it, but I eventually realized that I wasn't looking at a round human head sitting on top of a collar. It pushed forward off the shoulders, like the whole skull had been stretched out and set in front of the body instead of balanced over a neck. In that dim, early light, I couldn't see much in the way of detail. No eyes, no clear facial features, nothing I could swear to later. But the outline was clear enough. The front of it came to more of a point than a person's would, with a slope that made me think of a snout. The back of the skull wasn't round either. It tapered down into the neck in a way that reminded me of big dogs I've owned, only thicker through the base. The ears, or what I took to be ears, sat higher and closer together than a man's, little dark triangles poking up off the top instead of rounded shapes on the side. Standing there looking at that silhouette, I remember thinking it looked like somebody had taken the idea of a wolf's head, blown it up a size or two, and then dropped it onto a body that was never meant to carry it. I sat there dumbfounded, trying hard to make it into something normal. A bear, maybe. A big black bear standing to sniff the air. That made more sense than a person, given where we were. But I've seen a lot of bears in my time, and this, the way it held itself, the length of the arms, the strange posture, it didn't match. Whatever it was watching me. You can feel that sometimes. I couldn't see eyes yet, but the way it was squared up toward me, not turned to the side, not casual, that read as focused. The smart part of my brain started talking then. I was alone. I had no gun, just a chainsaw and hand tools. Even if it was only a bear, being out here between it and thick cover with nothing but a few logging tools wasn't where I wanted to be. I told myself to move, but not to run. Running from anything large with predator instincts is a bad plan. So I decided to do what I tell other people to do when they get spooked in the woods. Retreat toward my truck, slow and steady. First, I picked up the saw and set it in the sled with the cans. No way I was going to leave that thing out there. Then grabbed the rest of my gear and started shoving everything back onto the sled with more haste than care. The truck was maybe 300 or 400 yards back down the road, around a shallow bend. On a normal day, that wasn't much of a walk, but right then it might as well have been a mile. Eventually, I got moving. For the first 20-30 yards, nothing changed. The thing just stood there, half hidden in the slash and young firs, watching. Every few steps, I'd stop and look again, hoping it would have turned away, or dropped down, or resolved into a stump I'd misjudged. It never did. By the time I'd made it back to where I'd dropped the second tree, my breathing had picked up. I tried to keep it under control, but adrenaline doesn't care much about what you want. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. That's when it finally moved. It didn't shuffle like a bear dropping to all fours and waddling off. It stepped forward once on two legs, slow at first, like it was making up its mind about something. That step told me two things very clearly. One, it was tall, well over my height, maybe 7 feet or better. And two, it wasn't bluffing about being interested in me. I kept walking backward and tried to talk to it, because that's what you do when your brain is scrambling for anything normal. "Hey," I called out, voice coming out tighter than I meant. "You better move. I got work to do." Piss off. That would send most bears on their way if they weren't already too wound up. This thing cocked its head slightly at the sound, like it had never heard anything like me before, and then it dropped. 1 second, it was upright. The next, it folded down onto all fours in a smooth, ugly motion that looked far too practiced. The front end came down, long arms reaching, hands or paws, I still don't know what to call them, spreading in the leaf litter. The hindquarters settled behind, the legs bending backward at that wrong angle again. In that posture, with its back humped, I guessed it was still almost as tall as I am when I stand straight. The shoulders especially stood out, and it had a distinct hump just behind its neck. I've never seen anything like it before or after. Then it charged. There's a way things move when they're just bluffing, throwing weight around for show. This wasn't that. It came straight at me up out of the brush, water and dirt kicking out from under its limbs. It closed the distance frighteningly fast. I've seen dogs run, deer run, even moose, and this was completely different. Those long limbs allowed it to take massive leaps with ease. The road and ditch that had seemed wide a minute earlier felt about as big as a sidewalk just then. I did what any idiot with no better options would do. I finally turned and ran for the truck in earnest. All the advice about not running from predators, all the calm, logical things I know about wildlife, they evaporated as soon as I heard it hit the ditch, splashing through shallow water and rotten leaves. The sound of it coming up onto the road behind me, claws or nails scraping on rock, lit something primal in my head that did not care about logic. I ran as hard as I could with my gear, still unwilling to give up the sled. I could feel every extra pound I've put on over the years. Not even halfway to the bend where I'd parked, I had one clear thought. I was not going to outrun whatever that was. I'm not built for speed in the best of times, and this thing clearly was. What I did have was my equipment. I never put much thought into using an axe or saw as weapons before. They're tools, but in that moment, they were the only things with teeth I had. It took me a moment to decide, then I went for the saw. I cut to the side, yanked the sled around, and grabbed the saw out of it by the top handle, almost going down when the weight and my own momentum fought each other. I caught my balance, jammed the rear handle under my right arm, and yanked the starter cord with my left like my life depended on it, because as far as my body was concerned, it did. The saw coughed once, nearly caught, and died. On the second pull, it roared to life. The sound was a shock even to me after so many years wearing mufflers whenever I used it. In the enclosed space of that narrow road, with trees closing in on two sides, it bounced back at me, loud and ugly. I flipped the throttle lock and buried my finger, bringing the chain up to full speed. The bar shook in my hands, 20 inches of steel and teeth spinning faster than my eyes could track. I spun around and brought it up between me and the charging creature, feet planted as best I could on the gravel. I didn't think about technique or what would happen if it hit. All I knew was that if that thing really came for me, it was going to have to go through the saw to get to me. That way, I would at least hurt it and give myself a better chance of escape afterwards. It came into view a heartbeat later, barreling up the road, water and debris flying from under its limbs. Up close, it was so much worse than the silhouette. The chest and shoulders looked strong and heavy and were covered in fur, sitting over a narrower waist that was mostly exposed skin. The front limbs were not only long, but also thick with corded muscle, and ended in heavy, blunt digits that looked more like fingers than anything. The fur was dark, maybe black, maybe dark brown. I couldn't tell in that light. The head was forward and low as it ran, ears pinned back, jaws open just enough that I saw teeth. Too many teeth, too long for that mouth. There was no tail. I remember that clearly, maybe because part of me was still trying to call it a wolf or a dog, and the lack of that one detail kept deleting that option. It closed to maybe 20 yards before doing something I still think about at night. It saw the saw and dug in hard, claws biting into the gravel as it skidded to a full stop, stone and grit spraying out from under it. For a second, it just stood there on all fours, chest heaving visibly, staring straight at me. Then it slowly cocked its head to one side, like it was weighing its options, and rose back up onto two legs. Seeing that thing rise up to its full height, right in front of me, was the scariest thing I've ever experienced in my life, hands down. Panic took over. I screamed at it then, I think. I don't remember what I said, probably nothing that made sense. I just roared and held that saw like a shield, making as much ruckus as I possibly could in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to scare it away. It didn't flinch from the noise the way normal animals do. Instead, it started advancing again. A few slow, careful steps forward until it got to around 15 feet, close enough that I could see hairs moving on its chest with each breath, close enough that if it had pushed off hard, it would have been on me before I could even take a step back. Every part of me wanted to let go of the saw, turn, and run. That's all my body was screaming at me to do. Drop the weight and try to get away. The only reason I didn't was because some stubborn corner of my brain stepped in and pointed out the obvious. The saw had stopped it. That noise and those teeth were the only things that had put even a little doubt in whatever passed for its mind. If running was what prey did, then running wasn't the right move, so instead of giving ground, I did the last thing I ever thought I'd do in a situation like that. I started walking toward it. Not fast, not charging, just steady, deliberate steps, waving the saw out in front of me like a sword. That seemed to throw it off completely. It had been creeping forward like it owned the road and everything on it. As soon as I took that first step towards it instead of away, it froze. Its whole body went still except for its chest, which was still working hard. Then it lowered its head a touch and let out a growl that I felt more than heard. The chain noise sat on top of it, but underneath I could feel that sound in my own sternum. Its mouth opened wider, and its teeth came on full display. Up close, the face was worse than anything my imagination had been feeding me from farther back. The muzzle was shorter and heavier than a wolf's, with thick lips that peeled back just enough to fully expose the front row of teeth. Those weren't the teeth of some half-starved canine. They were long, thick, and crowded in there, yellowed toward the base. The nose was too broad and wet-looking. The eyes sat deeper than a wolf's, set under a heavy ridge that made its stare feel almost human. Everything from its forehead down to its lower jaw was bare, dark gray skin, not a hint of fur. There was rough scar tissue along one side of the snout, like it had been hurt or burned before and healed badly. I damn near pissed myself looking at that thing from not even 15 feet away, but I didn't stop. I kept putting one foot in front of the other, just enough that it could see I was willing to hurt it if it came to that. I kept the bar pointed at its chest. If it came, I was going to bury that chain in whatever part of it I could reach, and hope pain was still a language it understood. For a couple of seconds, we were stuck there in a standoff, me moving forward with a screaming saw, it standing tall over me, shoulders hunched, lips twitching, making that awful rumble. Then, little by little, it started to lose its nerve, or maybe just its interest. It eased one foot back, then the other, never taking its eyes off me. When I matched that with one more step forward, it finally gave up the straight-on posture. It turned its shoulders, keeping me in view over one side, and backed off toward the ditch in a crabbed sort of sidestep. The growl never stopped, but it got lower, more like a warning than a promise. At the edge of the road, it hesitated one last time, then dropped back down onto all fours in that same ugly, practiced motion. Once it was on the ground again, the decision seemed made. It spun, kicked off, and ran, really ran this time, down into the brush. In 3 or 4 bounds, it was off the road and out of sight. A couple of branches rustled and snapped, and then it was gone. I kept the saw up and stood there in the middle of the road for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute. My arms shook from the strain. My hands were starting to go numb from the vibration and the death grip I had on the handles. I stared at the spot where it had vanished and waited for it to come charging back out. When I finally moved, I didn't bother with the sled. I left the cans and tools where they were, turned the saw so the bar pointed up the road toward the truck, and started walking. Not running, I didn't trust myself not to trip, but as fast as I could without eating gravel. The chain was still spinning half-bore. If it decided to try me from behind, I wanted that thing between us. About halfway back, some tiny, sane part of my mind piped up and told me how stupid I must look. A grown man hoofing it down a logging road with a screaming saw in his hands. But the rest of me answered that thought with something simple. Better an idiot and alive than smart and torn to pieces on that road. I made it to the truck without seeing it again. The sudden quiet when I finally shut the saw off hit me almost as hard as the noise had. My ears rang. My heart was still thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat. I got in the truck, started it, and eased out of there much faster than I usually drive those roads, watching the brush and the mirrors the whole way. Once I had a couple of bars of cell service, I pulled into a turnout and sat there with the truck idling, trying to get my story straight. I knew 2 things for sure. I was not going back in there, and I couldn't tell anybody what I'd actually seen if I wanted to keep working in the industry. You can't call a client and say you walked off a paid job because something that looked like a werewolf stood you off on a logging road. You can't call a warden and tell him a two-legged dog thing charged you and expect anything but a note next to your name forever. But you can say you had a bad run-in with a bear. So that's what I did. I called the client first and told them I'd had what I thought was a big black bear come in on me while I was cutting, that it had charged close enough I'd had to use the saw to scare it off, and that I wasn't comfortable working on that property. The guy swore a little, asked if I was hurt, and then told me not to worry about it. He'd talk to the landowner and figure out whether they wanted to shut that piece down or send a bigger crew. After I hung up with him, I called the local warden service number and left a message. I stuck to the same version. Bear encounter on a job, animal not backing off to yelling, only broke when I lit the saw and pushed it. I said they might want to note it in case anyone else called from that area. At no point in either call did I say the word dogman or werewolf or anything like that. I'd never said those words out loud in my life up to that day. And I wasn't about to start with a guy who carries a badge. What I've told you here, the height, the posture, the head, the way it ran on all fours but thought on two legs, the way it sized up that saw before it decided I wasn't worth the trouble, that part lives with me. I don't have a name for it that I like, and I don't much care what anyone on the internet wants to call it. I just know I've spent my whole life in the woods, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. If you ever find yourself near Ashland, Maine, think twice before you head into the woods unarmed. Hey there, I'm a 27-year-old woman, and I've lived in Presque, Maine, my whole life, until last year, when I got charged and attacked by something that was neither beast nor man while fishing on the Aroostook River. I'm not into parties, social media, and all the girl stuff. When I don't work, I'm usually hiking, traveling, or fishing the river. I grew up fishing the stretch between Ashland and Presque, with my dad and my older brother. They both liked to fish late in the day, right up until dark, and that's what stuck with me. Over the years, even after they got busy and stopped going as much, I kept the same habit. Finish work, grab a quick bite, and head down to the river for a couple of hours before sunset. I knew a half-dozen bends and gravel bars like the back of my hand. I always felt comfortable out there. I never had a reason not to. Last year, I had issues with sleep apnea, and one day decided to head out before first light, just to see how it was compared to fishing at dusk. I headed out with my old half-ton Chevy a little after 4. Sunrise was supposed to be around 5:10. By the time I turned off the main road toward one of my usual pull-offs, it was still dark. The spot I picked is a little widening off a dirt road, not an official access, just a place people have parked for years. From there, a narrow path drops down through the brush to a gravel bar on an inside bend. It's far enough off the road that once you're down there, you can't see any traffic. That's what I liked about it. It felt out there, without being truly remote. That morning, I was alone out there, just as I'd hoped. I left the truck locked out of habit and started down the path. The drop to the river is maybe a 3-minute walk at a normal pace. I used the headlamp on low beam, just enough not to trip on roots. The woods were quiet. No other human noises at all, just a few birds and the constant sound of water. When I stepped out of the trees onto the gravel bar, I turned the light off and let my eyes adjust. The bend there is wide. On my side, there's a shelf of rock and stone that slopes gently into water that only comes up to mid-thigh for the first few yards. Across from me, the far bank rises a little sharper, with willows and alders tight to the waterline. The river in between runs maybe 30 or 40 yards across at that point, faster toward the far side, slower near my feet. The sky was just light enough now that I could make out shapes. Tree line, water line, the dark ribbon of current in the middle. My plan was simple. Wade out to just below my knees, work a small crankbait through the deeper slot along the far side, and see if the smallmouth were awake yet. I'd only been standing there a couple of minutes, just long enough to get the feel of the current around my legs, when I noticed it. On the opposite bank, roughly straight across from where I was, something stood between two willow clumps. At first I thought it was another angler. It was upright, tall, and in the half-light. It just read as someone in dark, bulky clothing. I could see the suggestion of shoulders, head, and arms. Nothing clear, just a silhouette. I remember my first thought being annoyance. Somebody had probably beaten me to the bend and decided to stand there in the one spot I usually cast to. I raised my hand and gave a short wave with the rod, just a friendly, "Hey, I see you" gesture. Most people out there will at least nod back or lift an arm. The figure didn't move. I stood there a few more seconds, eyes squinting, trying to see if they were turned toward me or away. The shape seemed to be facing my direction, squared to the river, not angled off. It still didn't do anything. No wave, no head turn, no shift in weight. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it started to look. The first thing that hit me was the way it held itself. It wasn't standing clean and straight like a guy on a riverbank. It was hunched forward, like its whole upper body was leaning over invisible handlebars. The head sat out in front of the chest, not on top of it. The upper back looked rounded in a way that reminded me more of a big dog stretching than any human posture. Then my eyes adjusted a little more, and I saw the legs. Whatever I was looking at stood on two legs, but the proportions were off. The upper parts, what would have been thighs on a person, looked thick and long. Below the knee, everything seemed too short and angled backward, like a big dog's hind legs when it stands up and leans on a fence. I've seen guys in waders, guys in insulated bibs, guys in all sorts of gear. None of them had ankles that far off the ground when they're standing. My brain tried to make it into a man in some kind of costume. Then it tried bear for a second. A big bear can rear up and look pretty human at a distance, but the legs weren't right for a bear either. The head was the last thing I focused on, but at that distance and in that light, I couldn't see any details. I don't know how long I stood there like an idiot trying to force it into categories that made sense, long enough for the uneasiness to catch up with me. "Hey," I called over, because that's what you do when you're trying hard to talk yourself into it, being something normal. "You out fishing too?" My voice sounded too loud over the water. As soon as I heard it bounce back, I regretted saying anything. The shape reacted, but not the way a person would. It didn't raise a hand. It didn't answer. It didn't shift awkwardly and yell that I was crowding its spot. The head turned a little, like it was listening. Then, in one quick motion, it dropped. 1 second, it was upright. The next, it folded forward and down, and all 4 limbs hit the ground. The sound of it hitting the shallows carried across the river, heavy splashes in quick succession. It didn't shuffle in place or back away. It had launched itself into the water and was now charging towards me. I didn't fully process what I was seeing. I just knew that whatever it was coming for me in a straight line. It made its way through the shallows in long, powerful strides. A big dog splashing in water is one thing. This was that same general motion, but scaled up and packed with a kind of power I felt in my gut. Each time its front limbs hit, there was a pause, then a surge, like it was covering more ground than made sense for the amount of space between footfalls. That was the moment I stopped thinking, person. No human being closes distance across a rocky, knee-deep stretch of water like that, on all fours, with that kind of rhythm. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. The gravel bar isn't big. It narrows quickly into the path that leads back up to the parking area. In my head, that climb suddenly felt 3 times longer than it really is. I splashed through the first few yards of water toward shore, half stumbling as the current grabbed at my lower legs. Once my boots hit dry stone, I didn't look back. I just ran. The rod banged against my shoulder. My tackle box slapped against my hip. Brush grabbed at my sleeves as I hit the path and started up. The incline is moderate, but in that moment, it felt like a mountain. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had made a mistake coming alone, and an even bigger mistake coming before first light. Behind me, over the sound of my boots and my breathing, I could hear it. The crashes through the water got closer, then changed. The splashes stopped. What replaced them was a series of heavy, irregular impacts on dirt and rock somewhere down and behind me. There was too much weight in each step for a person. It reminded me of the way a cow sounds when it gets out and runs across the road, only quicker. Whatever it was, it had left the shallows and was now on the same trail I was using. I don't know how I didn't fall. The path has roots, rocks, little washouts, plenty of things that can catch a boot. Somehow, I stayed upright. I kept my eyes on the strip of lighter ground in front of me and pumped my legs as hard as I could. The only clear thought I remember having was get to the truck. My Chevy is old. It's a late 90s half-ton with a tired engine and a driver's door that sticks when it's cold. When I broke out of the tree line and saw it sitting there in the dim light, it looked like the only solid thing in the world. I dug my keys out as I ran, fumbled them into the lock, and yanked the door open hard enough that it creaked, and practically threw myself inside. My hands shook as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. Outside, right on the other side of that thin strip of metal, something hit the truck. The impact came low and forward on the driver's door, maybe a foot or so up from the bottom. The whole door rang like someone had swung a sledgehammer into it. The panel bowed inward just enough that I felt it against my leg. The window rattled in the frame, but it didn't shatter. Whatever had hit the truck had done it with a lot of force. The shock of it made me flinch back and look left. That's how I finally saw it up close. The first thing I registered was the shoulder. Thick, furred, way too high off the ground for comfort. The fur was dark and matted in places, wet from the river. From the shoulder down, the front limb ran on for at least 4 feet, with a distinct elbow joint. Above that, next to the edge of the window, a head pushed itself up into view. Not all of it, but enough to scare the crap out of me. The muzzle was heavy and broad, too thick for any animal I could think of in that moment, with lips pulled back just enough to show the teeth. The teeth were what you'd expect on something that eats meat, but there were a lot of them, and they looked big even through a smudge of fog on the glass. The nose was black and wide, wet enough that it left a faint mark when it bumped the window. The eyes were the worst part. They sat farther back than a dog's, a little deeper, under a heavy ridge. It looked at me, not past me, not through me, at me. There was no confusion in it. It knew exactly where I was. All of that took maybe a few seconds. I yanked my head back, twisted the key again, and stomped the gas pedal, which usually helped. That finally brought the old V8 to life. Whatever was outside moved away from the door. I felt the pressure come off my leg. I threw the shifter into drive and let the truck start rolling even as I cranked the wheel to pull away from the creature. For a few seconds, I thought that was it, that I'd scared it enough with the noise and movement that it would break off. Then it appeared again, this time out in the open on my left, between the tree line and the dirt road. It ran parallel to me. At first it was upright, on 2 legs, shoulders hunched, and arms hanging. It covered ground in a way that looked wrong for a human. Too much rise and fall in the upper body, too much reach in the steps. We were only doing maybe 10, 15 miles an hour at that point. But the way it kept pace without any apparent effort turned my stomach. Seeing that thing with its strange, animal-like head run next to me on 2 legs was something else. Every couple of seconds, I'd glance left to make sure it wasn't changing direction toward me. Each time I looked, I caught a slightly different part of it. The bare skin on its stomach where the fur thinned. The way the muscles in its thigh bunched and released under the hair. The line of its back, sloping up from hips to shoulders, with that same unnatural hump I'd seen rise up right next to my window. Always the head turned slightly toward me. Always that eye on the cab. After maybe 30 yards, it dropped. It folded forward again in that same motion I'd seen on the far bank, and went down on all 4s. Then it really picked up speed. On 4 legs, it didn't look like a man at all. It didn't look like an animal either. It was just a big, dark, heavy thing that belonged on the other side of a fence or in a nightmare. Not chasing a pickup on a back road in Maine, I floored it. The truck picked up speed. The road there is narrow and not something you want to fly down, even on a good day. But I didn't care. Out of the corner of my eye, I finally saw it veer off into the brush. It didn't stumble. It didn't stop. It just seemed to decide, at some point, that I wasn't worth the effort. After a few seconds, it was gone. I didn't slow down. I floored the pedal all the way back to town. I wasn't able to just move on from this. The woods came right up to the place where I lived. Before that day, I'd always liked that. After what I'd seen on the river, I couldn't sleep in that house anymore. Every time the sun went down, and I caught a glimpse of the woods out the kitchen window. My stomach tightened. I ended up moving to Bangor a few days later. It's not as pretty, and I miss the space, but I sleep better with people and streetlights around me. I didn't share my encounter with the world until now. Just told everyone I needed a change of scenery. I did tell my dad and my brother what happened. I owed them that much, seeing as we'd spent half our lives together on that river. We were sitting at my parents' kitchen table when I laid it out for them, start to finish. They listened, and they didn't laugh. But I could see the looks they gave each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. My dad asked a lot of questions about distances, light, and how much sleep I'd had. My brother kept circling back to bears and people in weird gear. I answered everything as straight as I could and told them I knew what a bear looked like, and that this wasn't either of those things. I think they believed I was scared. I don't think they believed the thing itself. I did my best to convince them anyway. After we were done talking, I told them to come outside and look at the truck. We walked out to the driveway, and I pointed at the massive dent in the driver's door. For a second, neither of them said anything. My dad reached out and ran his hand along the crease. He let out a quiet swear and said there was no way a bear would attack a truck like that. My brother didn't say much, but his face changed when he saw how far the panel was pushed in toward where my leg had been. That was the only real moment where I felt like the story had landed. I asked them to stay away from the river for a while if they could help it. They nodded and said they'd be careful, but I know them. Every now and then, when the weather's right and the smallmouth are biting, they still head out. So far, nothing's happened to them. There haven't been any reports of animal attacks in that area for as long as I can remember. No livestock torn up, no anglers missing, nothing that makes the news or the local Facebook groups. That's the one thing that lets me hope whatever I saw that morning was passing through, or that it just isn't interested in people most of the time.